Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IOP Speaker Series event, The Politics of the Haves and Have-Nots. My name is Emily Price, and I'm a first-year student in the college from Frederick, Maryland, intending to major in economics and political science. At the IOP, I'm a member of the event ambassador team, the GATE, and UC Dems. This panel specifically is something I've been looking forward to for quite some time. Although all of us would love to stay content in our echo chambers, the vast majority of Americans have friends, family, and loved ones with beliefs on all sides of the political spectrum. I am certainly among that group, and especially in this time of unprecedented partisan vitriol, believe it more important than ever to find ways to work with each other instead of demonizing each other. Tonight, we are joined by an outstanding group of panelists to kick off the IOP's Divided We Stand initiative, a project that seeks to understand our divisions in this increasingly partisan world. Katie Porter is a former U.S. representative from California. While in office, she served on the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability, the Financial Services Committee, and the Natural Resources Committee, supporting key legislation to tackle economic, healthcare, and environmental reform, and, armed with a whiteboard, has been long committed to solving real person problems. Xochitl is a former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. Before she took that role, she was a House member from New Mexico, becoming the first woman and the first Latina to represent her district, and was later appointed by President Biden to the role of Undersecretary for Rural Development. She has dedicated her career to supporting rural development, protecting America's natural resources, and finding bipartisan solutions to problems that affect every American. Fain Lehman is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a think tank dedicated to advancing economic freedom and individual liberty in America's cities. He primarily works with the Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative and has published countless articles commenting on issues like policing and crime in New York, drug use in cities, and political violence. Moderating our discussion today is Jennifer Steinhauer, the Senior Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago and former New York Times reporter who spent many years covering Washington. Just some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. And second, when it's time for the Q&A, someone will place a microphone in the audience. And as usual, we will give priority for the first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check out the IOP's upcoming events, including Trumpian Tumult, What Europe's Meltdown Means for Us, which will take place at International House on January 29th at 5 p.m., and the Policy Challenge Super Bowl, where you can watch student teams from the University of Chicago, the University of Cincinnati, and the University of Kansas compete with their urban-rural divide policy proposals, judged by former U.S. Senator and IOP Pritzker Fellow John Tester. Finally, if you're looking for advice on how to go from being a college student to working on national campaigns and in government offices, IOP practitioner in residence and former communications director for Tammy Baldwin's Senate re-election campaign, Andrew Mamo, will show you on Monday, January 27th in the IOP's living room from 10:30 a.m. to 12 p.m. All of this and more can be found on the IOP's website. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Congresswoman Katie Porter, Xochitl, Charles Lehman, and Jennifer Steinhauer.
And thanks for coming to our first event of the Divided We Stand series. We hope you will all come to lots more of these as we roll them out. I want to jump right into it because I want to make sure we have three amazing guests, and I want to make sure we give lots of time to all of them as well as to you to ask questions tonight. So I think a good place to start is with what this conversation is not. This is not about parties, and we're not really going to debate policy. We're going to talk tonight about voters, because that's the part people still aren't talking quite enough about in an interesting way, and these three know all about voters. We're going to kind of move away from the paradigm of Republicans and Democrats and start thinking about the have-not voter, at least in terms of self-perception and the resulting kind of voting habits that we've seen. So this is, in some ways, if I were to kind of sum it up, this is a conversation in some ways about the white 50-year-old guy in Scranton who does not identify with any party, the Latino casino worker in Las Vegas who voted for Obama, and then Trump, and then Biden, and then Trump. The construction worker in the East Valley of Phoenix, the restaurant owner right here in Chicago's Chinatown, or the suburban guy in Bethesda who's hanging out on Twitch tonight and not even watching this. Those are kind of some central actors in this new populist politics. I think we can debate that, discuss that. And I want to start this conversation, and it's going to be a conversation. I will moderate it, but we will all talk amongst ourselves. I want to just kind of open up this whole notion with a quote. And the quote is, "For many years, the radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens." When I first read that, Katie, I thought that was something you said in the Oversight Committee. Or maybe it was something that Elizabeth Warren said on the floor, but it's not. It's from Trump's inaugural address. And he said that even as he was surrounded by powerful CEOs of different types of industries behind him. So given that, how is it that Democrats have become perceived as the defenders of the status quo while Republicans are sort of the radical change makers now? And not in terms of party identification, but who people identify with, who people see as the repository of their hopes and dreams in American life. So I would love to go around the room, starting with you, Katie, and just respond to that. How are you seeing voters in that framing that I just laid out, or do you disagree? And how has that happened? And how has populism taken over our politics and replaced parties in just a few short years?
Yeah, so someone said this to me, and I worried about this. Someone said this to me, and I thought it was really astute, which was that, I'm going to try to talk softer and see if that helps. Someone said this to me, and they said, oh, should I just keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay,
We'll fix it.
they said, I'm also really loud, so I can just be heard. They said that what's going on right now is not so much a push and pull between left and right, but between up and down. Okay. And I think that's exactly right. So these old ideas about left and right, people, even some of our most furthest kind of left people today, would tell you that they're not Democrats and that they don't affiliate with the Democratic Party. I think that the middle sort of ideologically has become, rather than being a compromise between left and right, has actually become just disenfranchised. Or they feel disenfranchised. So I think that's where this populism economic tension comes from, which is people saying government doesn't look like me, act like me, see me in any real way. And so then I don't feel connected to it. And then that naturally leads to, I think, also disconnection from political parties. But I would actually say it starts from a disconnection with government that has been going on for a while. And that then ultimately leads to disconnection from political parties. So I guess I reject this idea that one party or the other is seen as elite or the party of the people. I actually think generically, people do not see elected officials as working for them, or too often they do not see that, and instead see them as some other who doesn't understand them. And I'll just close with one example of this. When I was in Congress and did this whiteboard questioning of Jamie Dimon, and I laid out a budget of what someone would have to spend, kind of a bare bones budget, and showed that the person wouldn't be able to make ends meet. And they were getting paid, really by anyone's standards, a pretty good wage. That went viral, not because of Jamie Dimon's response, which really amounted to, I don't know. It went viral because people said, like, that's my budget. And we actually got voters who called our office asking where they could rent that apartment that we had found, because it was actually the cheapest apartment we could find in Orange County in Irvine. And so I think that's the kind of thing that people don't see enough of. And I think it comes from both parties. I actually see not enough of it, I would say, from politicians across the ideological spectrum.
Does that resonate with both of you?
I would say yes and no. There's clearly a generalized discontent, and that's a short-run thing and a long-run thing, which is to say, if I was to answer the original question, in part I would say the reason that Trump is at least able to position himself as sort of the anti-elite candidate is because the anti-elite candidate ends up being the guy who speaks to the poorly represented middle. And the poorly represented middle is defined in part by reference to whatever the most salient issues of the day are. And a lot of his short run of his success in the past election comes down to his ability to dominate the most salient issues, immigration, inflation, and sort of avoid the key social issues, principally abortion. But I think there's a longer term phenomenon, which gets to this sort of question about elite alignment, where there has been, in line with what you're saying about sort of a sense of disenfranchisement, a movement of what elite affiliation looks like at a partisan level. If we look at high income earners or the highly educated, they have over a period first of the past 8 to 10 years, but you can draw a longer line going back to the 1960s where they have shifted from the Republican Party into the Democratic Party. That's sort of going to necessarily create, unless somebody's really good at holding together a very large and therefore electorally inefficient coalition, that's going to create a counteracting effect where people who make less money, people with less education shift into the other party. So I think you are seeing a resorting, and that is just, we can talk about the normative merits of that. Is that good or is it bad? Which party, should parties want elites? Because there's an argument that parties ought to want elites. But I think that long-term trend is sort of necessarily going to identify one party with an elite. That yes, there is sort of a disconnection from government, but there is ultimately a preference among classes for one versus the other.
Yeah, there was something that both of you said, but I'll start with something that Katie said that really strikes me. And that's that people just have lost faith that government is really there to serve you. So it's not one party or the other, but it's actually maybe there's just no party that's really serving me. And my mom was a teacher, my dad was a social worker. So I grew up with the belief that someone from the government could be part of a solution, whether it's about making sure your kids had a good education or whether it was about being with families at some of their worst, most heartbreaking moments. And yet, at the same time now, even growing up, when my dad lost his job and had to get unemployment, he felt humiliated having to get help at the hardest point in his life. Mm-hmm. So there's this sense that government isn't there to be for me, they're there to humiliate me. And we've got to instead find a way to actually be that partner. And so I think there's actually some points of optimism here, even coming from someone who just left an administration, because there are, for me, in my lifetime, 2008 and 2016, when people showed up who normally don't show up to vote, because they thought, okay, maybe taking this time off of my job to vote is gonna matter. Now the question is, what do we do with that? What do we do with that resorting? How do we recorrect and ask the right questions to learn from how workers are showing up?
Well, this seems like an interesting segue, and Charles, I'll start with you on this because you and I actually talked about this a little bit. We obviously have to ask, where do patterns in immigration and the debate over immigration fit into this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously salient. If you look at polling, immigration is routinely among the top issues, if not the top issue that voters are talking about. The most startling thing that happened, if you're the kind of guy like me who looks at lines moving on charts all the time as opposed to talking to real people, having actual personal interactions like humans, if you just look at charts instead like I do, the most shocking thing that happened over the past cycle is this sudden inversion in Gallup's long-running poll asking people, Americans, should we have more immigration, less immigration, or the same level of immigration? In about 2022, 2023, prior to that point, Americans broadly favored about the same level of immigration or more immigration. And there is a sudden shocking inversion where today a large majority of Americans favor less immigration. In polls, a majority of Americans are consistently supporting constructing a border wall, engaging in mass deportations, depending on how you define it. So there's clearly a great deal of appetite in the electorate for a much more aggressive, conservative, Trumpian immigration policy. And then the question becomes sort of why? And you can answer this question in a lot of different ways, and this is a conversation we had, I do think this gets back to the conversation about the elite and about the populism and all the rest of it, which is that over the several years of the Biden administration, the electorate became aware of profound disorder at the southern border. At its peak, hundreds of thousands of people crossing the southern border every month. And that, I think, strikes the average American as fundamentally unfair. That's the word that I want to emphasize. There is a sense, and part of the rise in surveillance of immigration is not about, despite what people on Twitter will assert, it's not really about like a fear of, Americans not liking Mexicans. It's about Americans having a sense that there is something unfair about mass, undocumented, outside of the law immigration, and that a system that fails to control that fails to say everyone needs to play by the same rules, is not a system that is serving their interests. That's what gets back to the populist side, is that there's a loss of credibility if the guy who, for whatever reasons, decides he wants to walk across the southern border is treated with kid gloves. There's a loss of credibility among the population who says, why does he get this treatment when I don't, when I and other Americans don't?
So we're talking about the politics of fairness a little bit and distribution. And Katie, the cost of living, cost of healthcare, these were obviously signature issues for you when you're in Congress, and I assume they continue to be. Isn't that also about fairness and distribution? And does it intersect with the immigration question, or do you see this as a whole separate pot that comes together in a big populist ball, so to speak?
Well, first I wanted to, so did you want to say something about immigration, and then I'll take I will not forget the question, which is cost of living.
Katie, I appreciate that. I feel like sometimes I've got to respond to something, and I think what I appreciate about what you're saying, Charles, is that there is this sense of unfairness, and I think that's very fair that people feel that way. When you see a system that feels less orderly than you expect and you want it to be, and I would say that's another place where people feel like government has failed them, whether it's people from mixed status families, households, or whether it's people who are struggling to get by, or whether it's people who are now seeing folks on the street because there's no safety net for asylum seekers who have entered the country, followed the process that is outlined for them to follow, and yet there is no system for them to have an orderly court proceeding to determine whether they have credible fear. So I think you're absolutely right that feels unfair. I would say it's because we haven't had leaders who have risen to the occasion to address that. And on the same side, we have farmers who are saying we need farm workers. We need a reliable source of labor, and there's an opportunity for real solution making there.
Yeah. But is the logic of the policy, again, the logic of the policy feels less what's driving this movement than the vibes, right? It's a certain sense, the zeitgeist of fairness. And that was why I was actually segueing, and I appreciate your response to that, segueing to that piece of it, because it feels like a different policy area, but a similar response.
Yeah. Look, so I think that there is a deep anxiety about whether what lies ahead for us as a country is better than what is behind us. That's not a new political trope. People have trotted that out for hundreds of, the 100 and 200 years of American life. But I think it becomes really salient when you have what we have right now, which is really differential opportunity and economic experience across generations. And I think, again, the sort of Republican, conservative, Democrat, like the generational difference in economic opportunity and prosperity, I think is driving a lot of this. Yes, there are regional things. You're sort of example of this mythical Scranton voter, right? Like, if I ever meet that guy, so he's always a guy, he's always from Scranton.
He used to be president.
He always is white collar, like blue collar, didn't get a call, there are a lot of other, that one guy did not determine the outcome in any election. So what I would say is that when you think about things like homeownership, which have long been considered the kind of sort of really stable middle rung on the middle class ladder, that has become increasingly out of reach for younger generations. It's not that young people don't want to buy homes. It's not that they don't want to have families. They can't afford to. College, I remember one of my earliest sort of political experiences was going to hear my she was my professor. I didn't know her as a politician, I knew her as a teacher. But I went to hear Elizabeth Warren talk about her book, and she told, in Los Angeles, and she told this story, this is 15 years ago, and she told this story about going to Rutgers and how it costs $50 a semester and for her tuition. And she was a Senate candidate at the time, I think it was 2012. And I remember thinking, oh my God, she's gonna lose. she's so out of touch, right? And her point was that it doesn't cost $50 now.
Right.
But when we talk about things like, I'll give you an example, like what to do about student loan debt, what to do about the costs of education. We have lots of these questions about fairness, about rule following, about order. But the reality is the person who paid their way through college, like my dad, did it working a minimum wage job, part-time in college. That would not be possible today at the University of California system. And so I think that is, those economic shifts, those underlying economic shifts in opportunity give rise to this sense of it's unfair. I've done everything my parents did. I did more than my parents. I went and got a college degree. Maybe they didn't have one, right? I have 2 jobs. I'm a gig worker on the side. They had 1 job, and yet I feel like I have a much more tenuous grasp on that sort of economic ladder than the generation behind me. And I think that is only going to snowball because the size of the younger generation. So I think we're really at the beginning of grappling with that.
So let's put that thought together again with the sense of people distrusting and feeling disenfranchised by government. How do those 2 economic realities intersect very specifically with political choice making?
One of the things I heard from a lot of exit polls was, yeah, sure, this investment in infrastructure is fine, or this reduction in student loans is great. It's just not going to help me. And so that goes back to 1, government isn't working for me, and 2, that's unfair. And so when they are saying who's going to be the most trustworthy, is it the person who's going to say, yes, government can work for you, and these are all the ways that we're trying to make it, or is it the person who's saying, you know what, you're right, you've been screwed. And that's been the choice that people have had set before them, and I think that's what is the challenge right now in terms of what promises are made and how will they be delivered in the future, and it's also the opportunity if we really do want to fulfill that promise of being part of the solution when it comes to government.
I think part of what's really interesting about the way in which you're framing that is, so turn the clock back to 2008 or 2012, right? Because Barack Obama was an extremely skilled politician at mobilizing many of the themes that we're talking about and identifying himself as sort of a champion of the people, a champion of the middle class, a populist figure. And when he identified, I think successfully identified, the sources of inequality or unfairness in American society, it was often not government, but rather Wall Street. It was big businesses. It was the 1%. And the coalition that was organized then, which had sort of left and right variations, was set up as the source. The reason I can't get ahead in life is because the guys who run the banks are messing with me. That is, I think, not the case. That's not what you're describing. I think that's not how voters feel when they look at, I'm going to use the I word, which everyone wants to avoid. When they think of inflation, which is the thing that is challenging their pocketbooks today, they, right or wrong, identify that as a product of policy, of decisions that are made by the guys in Washington. And so the balance of who is credibly identified as the source of the unfairness has shifted, which is going to empower outsiders, which is going to empower, or at least people who are able to credibly identify themselves as outsiders. But I think also helps explain sort of a turn to the right, if for no other reason than there is an instinct on the left to say government ideally ought to help even if it's failing that goal, versus an instinct on the right to say we should be skeptical that government can help. Thus, the classic Ronald Reagan line, the 10 scariest words in the English language. I'm going to butcher the quote.
I'm government here to help.
Right.
Well, although I'm not going to ask this next, but I do want to talk about big tech because big tech's the new Wall Street. Everybody hates it while you all sit here on your iPhones. We'll get back to that. But
can I respond to something that that you were saying, Charles? Is, I would actually say that I'm not so sure Barack Obama was this big barometer of economic populism. In fact, I think that came out of the reality of Americans being foreclosed on, of feeling like there was one set of legal rules for all of us and another set that was not enforced for large financial institutions or financial markets. Whether that's true or not, I'm just saying I think that was the feeling. I actually think that you could argue that we didn't address while we addressed the rules, the policy, Congress created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we passed the Dodd-Frank law, we did all this, we didn't actually address any of the underlying economic harm from that crisis in a very effective way. So people who lost their homes, who lost their savings, who lost their jobs in that situation continued to do so. The second thing I want to say about this, I think it's really interesting, is I just want to observe that the alignment toward it's unfair and who's the source of the unfairness, which I think you correctly identify, has shifted from some set of business to now being government, that corporations speak about that politically. It's not just an organic, natural thing. The rise of and greater social media engagement, the different ways people consume information, the different media channels they watch, like there is an active ecosystem of people who benefit from saying, like, it's not us, it's them. And there is that tension back and forth, I think, between sometimes, I think wrongly, between sort of businesses and government, who I actually think need to work together and need to be sort of in cahoots to make our country work and strong and flourish. But I don't think it's just a naturally organic occurring phenomenon. Government certainly says it's not us, it's them. I just want to say I think it's naive not to own the fact that corporations also say it's not us, it's government.
For sure, and I want to get back to a specific question for you on that. But let's unpack government a slight bit more, because what about presidents' choices both parties made with regard to free trade, opening China to capitalism, forever wars, the shock of the pandemic? It was a pandemic, but the responses to that and the financial shocks that you talked about, those were all policy choices too. Yes, I mean that's government. Even if you don't sit in the office, sit in your house and think, I can't stand the circumstances that I'm living under, and it's all because of free trade agreements. Even if you're not saying that, you're absorbing the shocks of those many years of both parties, right?
I grew up 40 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, and in many ways we thought we would benefit from NAFTA, being right along the border, be able to manage logistics opportunities and coming in, but at the same time saw enormous increase in trade in Juarez, maquiladoras that moved over to the Mexico side, and increase in violence and drug violence along the border in Juarez. My dad, who's a very, very strong Democrat, says, you know what? NAFTA didn't stick the landing. NAFTA did not make sure that there was fair trade when it comes, not just free trade, and particularly around the way people are treated and the idea of offshoring manufacturing. When I think about challenges that we have to overcome, when we talk about free trade, it's got to come with thinking about the people and the impacts and what are going to be the replacement industries that happen that aren't just about college-educated degrees, but are also empowering vocational skills that are fundamental and needed for any society to be truly independent.
Charles, do you want to weigh in?
I want to give the human answer, not the wonky answer, which is that, and I have to do a little bit of it, which is that free trade has concentrated costs and diffuse benefits, and the net of the diffuse benefits almost certainly adds up to more than the concentrated costs. But to your point, the concentrated costs are real and substantial. America remains, objectively speaking, a manufacturing powerhouse because we are one of the most efficient manufacturers on earth. Our measured manufacturing efficiency really has never been higher. Pro and con, one of the arguably good things the last administration did was try to invest in that and build up that capacity even further. But because we have such an efficient manufacturing sector, we're no longer employing people. Those jobs have gone away. Those jobs have moved to, in many cases, increasingly towards friendlier countries like Vietnam, but for a long time towards countries that are willing to engage in unfair trade practices like China. And I think that creates not a nationwide constituency, not a majority constituency, but a meaningful constituency. Donald Trump won the presidency the first time with a minority of the popular vote as a relatively unpopular candidate, in part because he mobilized the people who were left behind by free trade. I tend to think that there are two sides to this. There's the economic adjustment side to it, which you can do. The empiric says people have adjusted from the China shock in many ways in terms of real income. But there's also, the people who are left behind in hollow areas that were dependent on manufacturing, that those cities just sort of shrivel and die. And there's the cultural side to it, which is, shifting somebody from a manufacturing job to a job in retail might ultimately, in real terms, yield an equivalent income, but it has a very different cultural character. Their experience of the world is different. So, I think that it has to be a part of the story. At the same time, I would say I don't think that can be the whole story today. That was much more the story in 2016 of this sort of concentrated cost coalition speaking out than it is today, where a much broader swath of people were expressing concern with, I think, a much broader set of issues, a set of issues that affected a much broader swath of people.
Well, let's segue back to you on this, Katie, and kind of stress test your thesis, because it's very interesting. So, is corruption, basically, or you might choose another word, endemic to American capitalism? And what role does it play in this conversation we're having? And how do we curb capitalist systems that are perceived as rigged and maintain our overall economic system? Is that possible? Does that link up to what the three of you just have said?
So, look, capitalism has been and will continue to be, I think, the engine that has created economic opportunity and mobility and advancement for the American people. And I think Democrats, if I could sort of say one thing we could have and should have done, that I think, is really lean into that people understand that when capitalism works well, it generates opportunities not just for the top, but all along the economic ladder, and opportunities for people to move up it. So I don't think that, I think that capitalism is sort of built on a set of assumptions that we know are not true in real life. So a great example of this is price transparency. Like, we don't have any in healthcare, for example, and yet we try to treat that like a healthcare market, right? And so I do think that it's important to have guardrails for capitalism, to have interventions and rules, and I think that benefits the vast majority of businesses who are playing by the rules. But I don't think the problem here is the fundamental economic system that we have. I think it's, that system necessarily has ups and downs. That's part of the nature of capitalism. It's not as stable, and that's sort of part of the reason that it goes up, is that it's not as stable. And so I think it's normal for people to have some sense of ups and downs, winners and losers. And I think one of government's roles is to think about how do we help people who are on the downside, whether that's workers, whether that's a certain industry, whether that's a certain area of the country, people impacted by climate change, whatever it is. I think that is an appropriate role for government to interface with business. But I would just say that fundamentally, I think that all Americans understand that prosperity in our economy with the right sort of government focus and cooperation should lead to prosperity for them. I don't think we've lost that as a premise, but I think people doubt that it always happens. And they question whether it happens for them as much as it happens for someone else.
And it seems like what you're saying is a fundamental, universal, long-time message from Democrats, and yet it didn't land, right? So Charles, walk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, to go back to the points about the economic realities of 2008, I think that was a story about, if not corrupt behavior by business, then irresponsible behavior by business. And we talk about why. But the most salient stories to me today about the bad behavior from business look much more like the healthcare market. And what I mean by that is that I agree, we don't have a market in healthcare, and that's largely a regulatory choice, that we design our markets in healthcare in a way that creates monopoly or oligopoly, that reduces price transparency. These are largely decisions made by regulators. And similarly, in many cases where business has lost legitimacy or public respect, it has much more to do with its interaction with government and government's free spending towards business. The story I think about is the Paycheck Protection Program during the COVID pandemic, which I, broadly speaking, think was a good policy move, because the idea was just sort of to shovel money out the door as quickly as possible.
Can you just remind people what that policy
is?
Yeah,
this was the theory was that the government, in essence, the government would underwrite the cost of laying people off. You would get loans to cover those costs, and the loans would be forgiven if people came back to work. But it also produced a great deal of fraud, right? There are stories about actually pretty blatant LLCs set up clearly simply to funnel money off of PPP. And on the one hand, I kind of think that was the goal of the program because it was a pandemic and we just needed to spend a lot of money. But on the other hand, I think people are, to go back to this theme about fairness, see that as a fundamentally unfair taking advantage of the system by businesses big and small, that PPP fraud by major businesses has been a source of contention. And so that's, that is an example of a case where businesses are behaving in a corrupt fashion because the state has created a system that makes it easy for them to do so, which returns to this idea of, why is this guy who knows how to set up an LLC getting a handout and I'm not? That seems wrong, even if at a macroeconomic policy making level, it was kind of good that that guy got a handout.
And the companies did the fraud, but it seems like to put the full circle this whole conversation, there was a lot of voter perception that was the Democrats' fault, right? They created the permission structure, if you will, legislatively for that to happen.
And in return, because it's the government's fault for not tracking down that fraud, then all of these additional rules and requirements get put on government in the future, these audit requirements that then make it less efficient to do a program in the first time. So now if you've got an application for the next program that's not PPP and not in a pandemic, but for something else, the application is going to be that much thicker because we're really worried about the times where it fails. And you've just got to find that right balance. How do you make government more efficient and more accessible, but also avoid as much fraud as possible?
Charles, you wrote a piece recently about the vice voter, which I wanted us to talk about. You've noted that Trump had embraced weed legalization, although did he? I can't tell. Crypto, maybe. Sometimes gambling, a little, it seems. Tell us more about that. Does this fit into the horseshoe frame we're talking about?
Yes, I think so. And I think, the place where, to get really into the weeds of the last election, the place where Donald Trump could have lost, or the decision that allowed him to win, in my view, was on a set of social issues, and in particular a sense that the Democratic Party is the more socially permissive party. Kamala Harris's strongest issue was abortion. She leaned on it very heavily throughout the campaign. And I think the perception there she was trying to drive was that the Republican Party is the party of telling you what to do with your body. And Donald Trump did everything in his power to clearly communicate that that was not what he wanted to do. You can believe him or not, but that was what the message was. And this gets back to sort of, I think, a rising sense of laissez-faire, to go back to gambling or marijuana or crypto investing. All of these are what I refer to as vices. They're things that are potentially addictive, potentially harmful. Crypto's a little weird, but in writing, you need to have three things. That's how writing works. It's the rule of threes. But so the Trump and the Harris pitch, both campaigns were interested in attracting young men who were suddenly and unexpectedly a swing constituency in this election. They ended up, by the way, swinging dramatically towards Donald Trump. And they decided, I think correctly, that what young men want is vice goods. They want to consume pot, they want to bet on their phones, they want to buy a little crypto and make it big. That's their sense of where the culture is at. I think it's not in an accurate sense. And both parties competed to say, yes, we are the more permissive on these social issues, in a way that is a dramatic deviation from certainly what the Republican Party used to do, in a sense, what the Democratic Party used to do a longer time ago. I'm a grumpy social conservative, so I think this is bad. But descriptively, I think it is a thing that's happening, and we can make judgments either way.
I want to go to questions soon, so we can go ahead and put the mics out. So we're going to do that soon because I want to make sure we get all of your chances to do that before we wrap. Are you willing and able to pick up on the tech question, because you were raising this idea of like corporations and when they're the boogeyman and when government is, and that seems to be the weirdest disconnect. I do feel like everybody sort of hates big tech, right? In a sense, and yet everybody embraces big tech. And how much is that? Do you think is that the new Wall Street, if you will, and how does that inform all the things we've been talking about?
So I think most people have the experience in their daily lives as voters of finding like virtually every product that technology has put out there to be helpful, to be better. There are some counterexamples. I think we all would quit liking having to push one and then put your phone number in 6 times and then there's phone trees. There are things that tech has done that I think lead to frustration, but I think, widespread, I think Americans would say This has been a big economic boom. This has made our lives easier. This has made so many things easier. I think whenever anything can be labeled big, it becomes a political opponent. So if any of you are part of any industry, any business, if it ever gets labeled big by an elected official, you got a problem coming, right? And so whether it's big ag or big tech, or I think one of the things this loses is just that like we have a big economy, and so we're going to have some big actors in it. I think the fundamental question is, are those actors engaged in competition? Are they engaged in productive economic activity? Are they helping to grow the economy? And are they doing it with either positive social effects or minimal negative social effects? And I think there are open questions, for example, about could that be true about AI? Absolutely. Will it be true about AI? That I think is a harder thing to say. So I think the question generally has been not that we should think about like technology as anything else. It can be harnessed for good, it can be used for good, and I think largely that has been the history of technology in the United States. It's the major reason that we have held on, I think, to our economic dominance in the world in like our lifetimes. I'm a little older than these people, but you get the gist of it. But I think there is a sense that people have about sort of back to this like, who doesn't have to play by the rules? What is my ability to control things, right? So technology's complicated that way. You input, and then your information goes, and we haven't really figured out how to see where that goes, and we haven't figured out what we should receive as a result of giving our information to a technology company that's going to profit from it in some way. And so I think there are lots of interesting questions there. But I would say fundamentally, I don't think that there was a particular economic boogeyman in the way that sort of banks were in 2008 following their widespread. I mean, let's face it, like the mortgage crisis crashed the entire world economy. I don't think that's. I think the questions with tech are more around, and that I'm more interested in, are more around, do voters feel like Congress can be competent, or the government, the administration can be competent at both figuring out what problems tech causes, figuring out solutions to them that don't impose consequences that are worse than the problem, and being able to stand up to the powerful forces that big companies are in this country to get to that right answer. I think they're skeptical about whether government's up to the task.
While staying competitive with other countries.
That's right. So I don't think it's about being opposed to tech. I think it's again back to like, here comes another change to our economy. What will this one mean for me? Right? And they're looking at their device and they're saying, I love this. Download, click, use. But then they're looking at the macroeconomic effect about jobs and who gets them, and competition and the ability to outsource jobs that has come with technology, for example. And I think that makes them anxious.
Okay, I'm going to ask Xochitl one last question, and then when I look up, I do expect to see students behind both of these mics, so we can move to their questions. So start lining up. So tell us from the perspective of New Mexico, the voters that I'm sure you've engaged with, who voted for Trump, but voted for Democrats for the Senate, maybe in state legislature, or those who've always voted for Democrats in state legislature, and we saw some places where Democrats still prevailed, but by the skin of their teeth. People who are splitting their ticket in that way, who are the most interesting voters, right? We're taking a group of students to Wisconsin over spring break to meet a lot of Trump-Baldwin voters, and we know there were a lot of them. As we wrap our part of the conversation, can you sort of describe that voter to us? Because I think that's at the core. He might live in Scranton. He might. Who kind of embodies this entire conversation in some ways?
So first, I think that voter is less and less, and that's unfortunate. They're just, one thing that's interesting is that as much as we talk about class, there is this sense of affiliation that is very hardening right now, and so there are fewer folks who pride themselves on voting for the person, not the party. But the people who do that are still very much thinking about how is this person showing up in my life? They don't expect you to have all of the answers, but they do want to expect that you're continuously gathering new information and you're doing something with it. You're hearing from the person that you're supposed to be representing and saying, this is the problem that you're facing. How can we best address it next? I think the swing voter is someone who recognizes that perhaps our world of ideologies are too complex for two parties. And they want to see if people are willing to navigate those nuances in a way that truly impacts their lives and accept new information. And I'm hopeful that there are more people like that who are willing to not say, this is just what one way, there's only one way to do it and it aligns with all of these columns, but rather say who's showing up to the conversation in an interesting way.
Let me just add one thing to that, which is I also think in the last 10 to 20 years, people's ability to get information about candidates is a lot different. So when I grew up in Iowa, my grandparents would talk about pulling the big D or the big R, and you could just hit one button and it would vote for every Democrat on the ballot or every Republican on the ballot. I think we've moved away from those kinds of voting systems, and I think people have the ability to sort of sift and sort so that party maybe is a less reliable indicator, or they're able to get beyond party to get the information they actually want about whether someone's showing up.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to start on this side of the room. As usual, rules apply. Say your name and year, and make sure whatever you say ends with a question mark. Go ahead. We'll start on this side.
Thank you all for the interesting panel today. I'm Sam Griffiths. I'm a master's student, 2026. My question is mostly about kind of the information ecosystem. That is like my mother, who's like the archetypal NPR listener who like shops at Whole Foods, called me a week before the election and was like, who do you think is going to win? And I was like, oh, I think Trump's going to win like 90%. Sure, that's going to happen. She was like, how could that possibly be true? And I went to undergrad in one of the poorest counties in the United States, and I saw like firsthand throughout all of Biden's presidency, like how mad people were about like immigration and inflation, but those two things kind of merged on some level. So I guess my question is, to what extent the information ecosystems maybe blind people from the economic realities of like the haves and have-nots and how that affects politics?
A lot.
Yeah.
I will start out and I'll be quick. I think they blind people, but they also segregate people. And that's, for me, the scariest part, because while you called this one right, and you absolutely had access to information that your mom or grandma, is it mom? Yeah. Mom. Your mom didn't. I think the harder thing is that conversation, thankfully, that conversation is still happening at your kitchen table, but it's not happening at most kitchen tables. And I don't think there's going to be one source of information ever, at least maybe not in my lifetime, that has such a broad spectrum of views and perspectives. So we've got to figure out a way to break down those niches so that there's at least more cross-pollination, so that NPR is providing coverage on communication that's happening elsewhere, and that your favorite podcast show is also providing what people are hearing on the NPR scene, so that we're at least aware of what each other are hearing in a more productive way.
Yeah, your mom's doing the classic Pauline Kael line, right? How could Nixon have won? Everyone I know voted for the other guy. But the difference is, and I almost disagree with the framing of the question, because the difference is, it was in fact much harder to know things about Nixon voters in 1968 or 1972 than it is to know about Trump voters today, because of the information environment. There are algorithmic incentives for people to be bubbled. There is reinforcing along that dimension, but it is much, much easier to know things today than it was 60 years ago, in a real and meaningful way. I look at numbers a lot of the day, and I can go figure out what was happening in the poorest county, in one of the poorest counties in America, pretty easily, in a way that you couldn't if you need to call up the U.S. Census Bureau in order to do it, and then they would take a long time to answer you. So I think part of what's going on there is that humans as a class, not necessarily your mother, who I'm sure is a wonderful person, but humans as a class don't necessarily optimize for knowledge. We often optimize for what makes us comfortable. We often optimize for what rewards the in-group. And so I think it's less about the information environment and more about what we're doing with it. And I think it takes a real shock often to get people to go, I need to update because my model of the world is very wrong in some pivotal way. In many cases, I would have hoped that happened a decade ago with Donald Trump. It hasn't for a lot of people. Maybe it will happen again this time. We'll see. There's clearly a lot of inertia. But I think the injunction ultimately has to be personal, which is like, if you don't understand what happened, that's probably on you.
Let's go over here.
Hi, my name is Yang, graduate student in sociology. So in the inaugural address, we've seen that a lot of tech moguls sat in front of the cabinet members. It appears that both the MAGA people and the Doge people, which I would say those tech moguls represent, they somehow have this anti-clerical coalition forged by Trump. The clerical class is what they say, PMC, the professional managerial class. And a good analogy is to the ancient regime's 3 different estates, the second and third, pulling a coalition against the first, which is the professional managerial class, let's say. So this is the centripetal force putting these 2 coalition together. But they are also centrifugal force, like what happens in H-1B visa discussion. So I wonder, how does Democrat process all this? And is oligarchic populism the game of the day?
Big question, short time. So one person, who wants to take that quickly? So we can get to as many questions as possible.
I'm a Republican. So actually not.
I think maybe the interesting point here in the intersection of a democracy is the competition piece that Katie was talking about earlier, in terms of a democracy, a representative republic, and a capitalist society work when there's healthy competition. And if the government is colluding too much with certain types of big tech, for example, then there's not healthy competition. But if at the same time they're always pointing at the other and say, oh, it's the other guy, then it's not a productive environment either. So how do we ensure that we're not giving off enormous deals to certain sectors or parts of a sector, but rather fostering competition more appropriately?
We're here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming again today. My name is Rishabh. I'm a first-year MPP candidate. So President Biden, in his farewell speech, warned of the imminent and impending oligarchy coming into power. As you have all agreed, a substantial part, if not a majority of the population, don't feel as though our government is representative of their interests. So what are some tangible policies or normative shifts that need to occur for us to see greater public trust that our government best represents our interests?
That's a very big question, and I'm going to let everybody say one sentence. It's a bonus. It's like a speed round.
So I would say that having more competitive elections by design, so that you have more competitive elections, creates behavior in elected officials where they engage in a meaningful way with their constituents. We both represented super competitive districts, and the ways that we went home and were present and gained people's trust through actual interactions, as well as social interactions and media and other things, like, it's just really different than what most people do. So I think having more competitive elections would cause politicians to engage with their constituents more, because they'd have to if they wanted to win.
Anti-gerrymandering, your turn.
The innovative housing opportunities. That includes permitting and manufacturing.
Are you retweeting endorse on that one?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
totally. Oh, wait, no, that's fine.
Hi.
No.
No, that's good. Go.
My
We
name
got a lot
is
of questions.
Oliver. I'm a second year in the college. I am from Toledo, Ohio, where those mythical swing voters definitely still exist. My question is mostly for Congresswoman Porter. As a member of Congress, you supported removing the cap on the SALT deductions, which is a tax cut that disproportionately benefits well-off suburban homeowners. How do you feel about the responsibility of a party like the Democratic Party that wants to say, we stand for people who are at the lowest points in their lives, we stand for helping people, lifting them up when they need support, while balancing the needs of the people who have kind of become our primary constituents?
So look, for those who don't know, the state and local tax deduction cap was put into place by President Trump as part of his tax package. He now is saying that it wasn't me, and he's going to take it away, as if he just put it there a few years before. There's no doubt that people who are homeowners tend to be toward the higher end of the economic spectrum. Like, that's just the nature of homeownership in this country. And so there's no doubt that allowing people to take a bigger deduction would benefit those homeowners rather than, for example, renters. But I kind of reject the premise of the question, which is that this mindset that we cannot be fair to taxpayers, regardless of the state they live in, whether they pay state and local taxes, like I do in California, or they don't, like in Texas. I don't think those two taxpayers ought to face different federal tax burdens because of that. I think you can have that kind of tax fairness, and you can still say, we are the party who is going to recognize that having safe and quality and secure housing is something that every single American needs to have to thrive.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Owen. I'm a third year in the college. This question is also for Katie. You speak to this idea of kind of up and down distribution rather than left and right. I think it's fair to say the Republicans leaned a lot more into that kind of rhetoric this cycle. How do you think Democrats start to, especially the entrenched kind of center of the Democratic Party, get away from that image of them being the party of the status quo?
Yeah, so I think this matters a lot with who we elect and how we recruit candidates, and having candidates that come from a lot of different backgrounds. And I think Democrats have a lot of work to do on that. We represent mostly urban areas. Democrats' areas tend to be more urban. And Democrats in deeply urban areas tend to get reelected again and again and again. So that means we have a lot of senior leadership in the Democratic Party, who is they're from cities, they're well educated, they're maybe from a wealthy family. I think we made real strides in 2018 in the Democratic Party in the class that Xochitl and I were part of electing younger people, of electing people from different walks of life. When I went to Congress, I was the only single mom there. You were one of the youngest members of Congress when she went. And so I think that when you elect people who have a variety of kinds of experiences, including economic experiences, then they will naturally become more of a sounding board. But I think there's two parts to that. One is electing them, and two is listening to them and empowering them. And I think that Republicans have generally, through their party, how they structure themselves in Congress, done a better job allowing newcomers to bubble up. Now, sometimes, I don't like the newcomer, and I'm like, please stop empowering the newcomer. But I do think from a sort of theoretical perspective about how democracy should work, that is a good thing. I mean, I stood up in a caucus meeting in, I think, 2021, Democratic caucus meeting, and said something about the price of food. We were talking about the price of gas for the 18th week in a row. Just really it's a big problem. Price of gas is a big problem. But I stood up and said, you know what I really am dealing with is the price of food. There was a Politico article about that, as if it was some major political event for somebody to observe that boxes of cereal were costing $7 and $8. Everybody in Congress should know the boxes of cereal are costing $7 and $8, because everybody should be in the grocery store, right? Not every day, not every minute of every day, but not once every 6 years. And I think that's a big problem.
I think you presaged that problem. It's a political one for Democrats at that point. Over here.
Hi, my name is Shannon. I'm a fourth year in the college. And a lot of the attacks kind of from the right against claims of unfairness have been centered around diversity, equity, and inclusion and affirmative action. As someone who's socially liberal myself, I kind of see those more and take the kind of democratic perspective of those kind of advanced fairness. But I was wondering how you guys view the balancing, implementing policies that actually create more fair and equitable societies versus the potential for those policies to further this zeitgeist of unfairness that these have-nots have.
I want to push back on the framing of the latter. It's not that it's furthering the impression, it's that to the majority of the American people, when you poll them on these topics, pretty consistently, they regard them as unfair. I happen to agree with them. I think that racial preference is socially harmful and individually wrong. And I think that that is a wildly popular opinion. And so part of the reason that this has been a lodestone around the neck of Democrats is that they are choosing to align themselves with a fairly novel set of values that is not shared by many of their fellow Americans. This gets back very briefly to the last question, which is that yes, candidate recruiting matters a great deal. And I'm not a Democrat, and I shouldn't recommend things to Democrats. But very briefly, I think the best thing that congressional Democrats have done thus far this cycle is choose to vote for the Laken-Riley Act, the immigration enforcement bill that just passed through the House, which is a tough on immigrant crime bill. And the reason for this is that they understood that the Democrats who voted for it understood that this is currently a losing issue for them, that they are out of step with the American public on this topic. I think the same thing is true of the Biden administration's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that this is tremendously unpopular because most Americans don't look at it and go, well, we're advancing the position of different groups and we're going to carefully design the racial makeup of American society so we can achieve equity. Look and go, why are we treating people differently on the basis of race? I believe that is wrong. And it's not a winner to disagree with that.
Do either of you want to respond to that?
Sure. The thing I will agree with you on, Charles, is that as Democrats, we're not always focusing on the thing that impacts people the most. I was knocking doors in Nevada, and a person answered the door who, in my mind, which is outdated and frustratingly checkboxy, would have checked a lot of those boxes about what DEIA stands for. But when I asked her whether or not she was going to vote, she wasn't sure. And when I asked her, if you were to vote, who would you likely vote for? And she said, well, maybe Trump. And I said, okay, why is that? And she's like, well, I really care about health care because I have to take my mom to her treatment every week. And it's really hard on me and it's really hard on her. And I just don't think that right now things are fair. And that, to me, reinforced better than anything else that we've got to look at a whole set of issues, and we've got to advocate for all of them, but we cannot lose sight of what's impacting people every single day. So here, Democrats pushed me to see and to celebrate differences in a really important way, and to be able to lead with that, because I never felt Latina enough because I don't speak perfect Spanish, and I never felt woman enough because I don't have kids. And they pushed me to say, okay, you know what, let's learn about each other's differences and care about them. But one thing we fail at is losing sight of the ways that we do experience things similarly. And we do have to lean into that more.
Yeah, I would just say that I've thought a lot about this back and forth about identity politics, that this term gets thrown around. I think it's pretty ill-defined, but widely used. But I would just say, to your point, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to have an identity? And I think when you're at a door, you hear from people. I identify as a patient. I identify as a mother. I identify as a retiree. I identify as a consumer. Those are also important identities, and they are held across some of the traditional identity buckets that I think politicians have often leaned into. So lots of kinds of people of different ages and different races and different ethnicities and different parts of the country would say, I have a view as a patient and I want someone to speak to that. I have a view as a parent that I want someone to speak to. And I think that's sort of a way to think about identities that I think both parties actually could do a better job of doing. And I think it would be to our great benefit of our democracy to become less divided if we were able to recognize that people's experiences shape what they care about, period. But we have a lot of common experiences and we often don't use that vocabulary and we often don't recognize those.
We're about to wrap. If you have a question that can be asked in approximately 10 seconds and then one that can be answered in about 30 to 45 seconds, you may go.
I think it would take longer than that. Thank you.
Oh. How about over here?
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for coming. I'm Matt Ryan. I'm a graduate student at the School of Public Policy. I guess a simple question is just, we spent a lot of time tonight diagnosing what the issues are, right? And I'm curious to hear from all of you, what you think the kind of future, the next year is going to bring for us, and if there's any reasons for optimism in particular, what those might be. Thanks.
One sentence each.
Okay, so I'm going to answer the question I wish you'd asked, which was...
And this is why she was
sorry
racist.
To disappoint.
Yeah, which is that I guess when I hear people who are concerned about this year or are kind of celebrating about this next year, either way they're approaching it, I guess my biggest advice to them goes to what we were saying about, I don't know anybody who voted for fill in the blank. I think one of the best things you can do this year is spend some time engaging in a social or nonprofit or volunteer or religious or I don't care, but not overtly political capacity, where you will encounter people across different political views. So animal lovers come in all different political ideologies. If you do something like that challenge yourself to connect in a human way with people who voted opposite of you, I think that's very affirming right now, even as people are kind of feeling like, I don't want this to happen, or I can't wait for this to happen, and feel very divided into two buckets that way.
15 seconds each.
Please. Oh, I was going to say, I'm optimistic about if we can deal with this tariff nonsense, then we get like 4 or 5% growth. That'd be awesome. No, look, I think a majority of Americans are actually optimistic about the future. The president has a majority approval rating. Many people in Congress have a majority approval rating. And so if you are not optimistic, perhaps it is good to talk to. I agree. You should talk to those people and figure out why they're optimistic, because they're not crazy. They're your fellow Americans.
I'm optimistic because parties are fighting over representing the working class. I just think that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I learned a lot in this conversation. I hope you all did too. I hope you come to more of our speakers events and Divided We Stand events. And I just want to thank you so much to our guests who took the trouble to come to Chicago tonight to have this conversation. So thank you so much.